From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Kaylee Lyons. Kamala Harris and Tim Walz kick off a bus tour in the battleground state of Georgia as RNC co-chair Lara tells Bloomberg the Republican Party is considering putting more money into two other swing states, Pennsylvania and North Carolina. We'll hear some of my conversation with her this hour, and I'll be joined by Syracuse University political science professor Jenn Jackson and our political panel. Plus, former Defense Secretary William Cohen is coming up as Israel carries out a large-scale military operation in the West Bank, with tensions rising in the Middle East. But we begin this evening with the Democratic ticket, Kamala Harris and Tim Walz in the swing state of Georgia. They're there at this hour. It's part of a multi-day visit to the Peach State to rally support for their campaign. We're joined now for more by Bloomberg Government's Angela Greiling Keane and Bloomberg's Texas Bureau Chief Julie Fine. Julie, I want to come to you first because it's not just that they're in Georgia. They're specifically in southern Georgia, making stops to many rural areas of the state, not necessarily going to the urban areas in which they can count on more Democratic support. What's the strategy here?
Well, the strategy is they know they can count on the urban areas. They need a little more help. So they're going to these areas where they're hoping they can chip off some, and then the total of the sums really show they made the correct play there. So by going to these rural areas, they're also saying, we want to speak to everyone and trying to broaden their base. Kaylee?
Well, and of course, as they do so, they're trying to broaden the map, frankly, Angela. Georgia was a state in which we did not think Joe Biden was likely to win against Donald Trump. At least polling suggested it would be incredibly hard for him to do so. Harris is polling at least within the margin of error of Trump in Georgia. Now, New York Times Siena had them at 50-46, right ahead of the DNC. So how much of this is also forcing Trump and the Republicans and the RNC to spend money in a state they didn't necessarily think they would have to spend to spend many resources to defend?
Oh, absolutely. That is part of the Democrats' plan. They are sending their candidates to a state where Trump had an advantage when Biden was at the top of the ticket. But that has changed now that Kamala Harris, of course, is the candidate. The Republicans won. They want to win in Georgia. They want to win in Pennsylvania. They want to win in Wisconsin. And those are three states where they're spending a lot of time. But by sending the Democrats there right now to Georgia, the Republicans will have to return that volley at some point soon.
Well, J.D. Vance was spending time in Pennsylvania today. In fact, we actually heard from him there weighing in on Georgia and specifically the issue between former President Trump and Georgia Governor Brian Kemp.
Now, look, the president has some personal disagreements with Brian Kemp, and Brian Kemp has some personal disagreements with the president, but they're both big enough to put the country over personal interests.
It does seem, Angela, like we're seeing a concerted effort among Trump and those close to him to try to make nice with Kemp again, considering he is a popular governor in Georgia, and attacks on him don't necessarily land well.
Right. It's obviously a Trump ism to be enemies with somebody and then turn around and be friends. And we've certainly seen that with Brian Kemp. He was the attorney general in the state when Biden very narrowly won just about 12,000 votes in 2020. And, of course, oversaw that counting as well as the recounts in both of the Senate races that year. So he did not curry favor with Trump by that recount result. But at this point, Trump needs all the friends he can get, and he certainly wants to have the governor of a key state, who is a Republican, on his side, and therefore needs to be friendly.
Well, of course, we've been paying attention to what Trump says about other members of the Republican Party. Julie, we also have been paying attention to what he says about the Democratic ticket. And both he and Vance have lobbied much criticism at Kamala Harris for not to this point sitting down for a big interview as the Democratic nominee. That will change tomorrow. While she's in Georgia, she's sitting down alongside Tim Walz for an interview with Dana Bash on CNN. That's going to air tomorrow night. How high stakes is that moment for her, considering she hasn't been very open with the press in the last 5 weeks?
It's a very high-stakes moment for her, and she's also taking some criticism because she's not doing the interview alone. She is doing it with Tim Walz. However, at the end of the day, she is going to be the one that has to answer the questions, even if he's just sitting right beside her. So it's high stakes. It's the first time it is that situation. It is a one-on-two. The only thing for her is, if she does not do well, she does have a debate around the corner. But on the flip side of that, if she does not do well, her answers could come up in that debate, Kaylee.
Well, yeah, so all eyes will be on September 10th after this. Arguably, Angela, it is a chance for her to take corrective action, if you will, if she has missteps in this interview. But it does also mean perhaps that we're not going to have to wait to see her share a stage with Donald Trump to get more specifics on policy. She's talked in very broad strokes, did so as well last week at the DNC while we were there in Chicago. Is she going to get forced to drill down tomorrow?
She'll definitely have to go into more detail than she did last week, but she did go into more policy than a lot of people expected at her convention speech. She introduced herself and her biography, but she also certainly hit on a number of policy areas. One area she skipped at the convention that was definitely noticed was climate. Obviously, the energy industry was quite happy with those results, but on the other hand, the environmental side, who tend to support Democrats, were not quite so happy with her omission of climate during her remarks. So do expect her to be questioned in more detail on the policy areas, certainly climate, since that's a remaining question in the interview tomorrow. And then, of course, there will be more questions at the debate that go into specific policies.
Well, while we didn't hear much from Harris on climate at the DNC, we heard from her and many others about the idea of democracy and whether or not it would be secure if Donald Trump won the presidency in November, especially considering what happened in 2020 and his idea that he is still putting out there that he thinks he won that election. He, of course, factually did not. But earlier today, I spoke with the RNC co-chair Lara Trump and asked her about the questions Donald Trump has been raising about accepting the election results and election integrity overall. This is what she said.
We've gotten a lot of pushback from Democrat-run states, and it's been very challenging to get transparency in an issue where we really need transparency. But I believe that what we are doing right now at the RNC is going to further the notion that we do indeed have free, fair, and transparent elections. And so I think Donald Trump saying if this is a free election and a fair election and there's no funny business here is a perfectly legitimate thing to say.
But, Julie, to this point, we've had no proof of funny business in 2020, and there is no indication that there will be any funny business in this election.
Yeah, I mean, clearly they are sowing doubt on whether or not they are going to accept these election results. And listen, the former president has spent a lot of time on the campaign trail still talking about 2020. He's taken some criticism from fellow Republicans about not talking about the issues. But clearly they are trying to lay the groundwork to say if we find something that we don't think is right, we may be saying something about it later. So this is definitely leaving the door open for an issue that the former president continues to bring up on the campaign trail.
Well, and on the notion of election security, of course, earlier this month in Georgia, they adopted rules that essentially will make it easier, Angela, for election officials to either delay or not certify the results. How closely do we need to pay attention to what is happening in these individual states, especially the ones that could be decisive in determining the Electoral College?
We need to be following that very closely. Election integrity, and that comes from both sides. Election integrity is not necessarily just what Republicans say. It might be in terms of cheating that they think might happen. But election integrity means that people can get to the polls, that they can cast their absentee ballots, that the ballots are fairly counted. And one area that people are following closely is poll watchers. There have been many, many poll watchers hired by both parties, but more by Republicans to ostensibly make sure that access is open to voting, but Democrats fear that those same poll watchers may actually intimidate voters from showing up and casting their votes in person.
All right, Angela Greiling King from Bloomberg Government and Bloomberg's Julie Fine, thank you so much for joining me. And there's another story we're watching today. It has to do also with the Supreme Court, as they dealt a blow the justices handed a defeat to the Biden administration. The court refused to reinstate, for now, the president's recent effort at reducing millions of student loan bills. The ruling keeps the multi-billion-dollar plan on hold while the legal fight plays out. A Department of Education spokesperson did not immediately respond to a request for comment. This, of course, an issue that could have particular importance for young people in this election cycle, and we're going to dive into that next with a professor who has been following the youth vote closely. Jenn Jackson of Syracuse University is next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Fighting to protect your retirement benefits, lowering taxes for working families, and finally making corporations just pay their fair share. They're doing fine. They're doing fine. They can pay their fair share.
That was Minnesota Governor Tim Walz with firefighters in Massachusetts earlier today. He's now in Georgia alongside Kamala Harris as the two of them, representing the Democratic ticket, embark on a bus tour of the battleground state over the next 2 days. So let's bring in now here on Bloomberg TV and radio political science professor at Syracuse University, Jenn Jackson, for more on Georgia and the state of the race. Jenn, welcome back to Balance of Power. It's worth pointing out that the places they're visiting in Georgia aren't necessarily the big cities. It's not Atlanta, though they will have a rally in Savannah when this wraps up tomorrow. They are targeting rural areas, specifically areas in which there is a high concentration of people of color. What do you make of this strategy?
You know, there is really a lot of interest right now in ensuring that folks who are not typically tapped into the mainstream of electoral politics, that they are getting excited about this election. The focus from Harris-Walz has clearly, from the DNC, as you can see from last week, in the last couple of weeks since Walz was announced, that there's an interest in really bringing folks into the fold who may have been a little bit dismayed with how the Biden administration had been handling the campaign, with his performance at the debate, and with the fact that he was still going to be the nominee. So now there's this kind of excitement about this current ticket, and they're reaching out to folks who I believe that they think may come back into the fold with them.
Well, it is worth noting as well as they try to bring people back into the fold, black voters included, that Kamala Harris is making history here. She is a woman of color leading a major party's presidential ticket, and yet she doesn't necessarily really seem to be leaning into the historic nature of her candidacy. Jenn, is that wise? Do you think that's a political decision or a personal one?
You know, I love that you asked if it's political or personal. I believe the personal is political. And I think that when we saw President Barack Obama say, I am not the president of Black America, I am the president of all of America, he was helping us understand why this is so important for those folks who are running for office who are in this unprecedented position, because there will be people who are concerned that they are just running on a specific set of limited issues, that if you are a woman running for the highest position in the United States, that you are just there to focus on women's rights to the detriment of other folks' rights, that if you are a Black American, that you will just focus on the issues affecting Black America. And so a lot of this messaging is to signal to folks who have those concerns that maybe this is not going to be just for one subset of the electorate, right? Maybe this is a campaign for everyone. Maybe this is an administration for everyone. And that is a political choice. But I also think that when we think about Kamala Harris's record, who she was in California and who she's been since she was in the Senate and the White House, it's actually very much on brand.
Well, as we consider her trajectory here in the policies that she has adopted, we have seen her do some flip-flopping, Jenn, like, for example, the issue of fracking. In 2019, when she was running in the Democratic primary, she was all for a fracking ban. She has since changed her mind on that and didn't address climate really at all in Chicago at the DNC last week. And especially for younger voters that you spend a lot of time interacting with and talking to about the issues. Is that a problem for her?
You know, the young people I'm speaking with, the folks who are millennials and Gen Zers are concerned about the kind of lackluster policy platform that we have so far, which is not much, right? There have been concerns that not much is being said. But when I ask young people what they think about that, they say, oh, well, that's exactly what Donald Trump has been doing this entire time. So they see it more as a political choice to not reveal a lot about the Harris-Walz kind of policy initiatives that will happen in the first 100 days. But it actually does also kind of instigate a lot of anxiety among young people who are wondering what this means for them, right? The flip-flopping is scary. The uncertainty is scary. So while it is I think a smart political decision right now, it's not smart in the long term.
Well, certainly Donald Trump has called attention to the flip-flops of Kamala Harris, but he also has lobbied any number of personal attacks against her. He's openly talked on the campaign trail in recent weeks about how his advisors keep telling him not to do that and how he, when pulling his audience who then cheers, wants to keep going with the personal attacks. I asked the RNC co-chair and his daughter-in-law, Lara Trump, about that earlier today, whether or not he needed to be focusing more on policy. This is what she told me.
Donald Trump was such a great brander of people that it really gave him an edge during the primary with 16 other candidates, all of whom could have been great presidents or great presidential nominees for the Republican ticket. And you look at the way that he branded Hillary Clinton. You look at the way that even in the early primaries in 2024, you saw him do the same thing with people like Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley. It's Donald Trump who was left standing at the end.
So whether you want to call it branding or just personally attacking, Jen, is that something that works with anything other than Trump's base?
You know, I think that's really a great framing. And I think us political scientists who study this work find that so intriguing, right? The idea that Donald Trump is branding these other candidates is actually hilarious because we know that from the priming literature that actually it's priming that he's doing. He's tapping into people's existing biases and pulling in those stereotypes, those ideas about racial minorities, gender minorities, about people who are different from him. And he's highlighting them and casting a light on them, a negative light in most instances. And that's sticking. The area where he struggles with that is where you have someone like Kamala Harris, who's been in politics for a very long time. It's going to be really hard for him to change the Harris brand when Harris has already created a brand for herself, right? I think that since so many people already know who a Kamala Harris executive is, they don't actually have to listen to Trump to find out what that might look like.
Well, she may have another chance to help define that for herself tomorrow when she sits down for her first big interview on CNN. Jen, what does she most need to answer for in that conversation?
I think that she really needs to talk about Gaza. You know, most people were very concerned about the DNC and the fact that there were Palestinian folks who were present, who had speeches prepared, who were actively asking for accountability in that context, in that framework, and who were not allowed to speak. There are a lot of people who are supporters of Harris-Walz, who are excited about Harris-Walz, but who are still concerned that we're in a place where we're supposed to be getting back to a frame of democracy, but we have groups of people who are not allowed to even be listened to and heard. I think she also has to talk to young people about her stances on policing. She had a lot of police officers, sheriffs, carceral folks, correctional folks involved in the DNC. And while that was absolutely a choice to try again to bring in those people into the fold who maybe have been looking at her as maybe not their candidate, it also is alienating people who have been looking at her as their potential hero. So she's got to speak to those audiences who are now concerned that she might not be in their corner anymore.
All right, Professor, always great to have you. That's Syracuse University political science professor Jenn Jackson. Thank you so much. And coming up, we'll have the takeaways from Nvidia's quarterly earnings report. Shares down in after hours, plus a preview of Bloomberg's interview with the company's CEO, Jensen Huang. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Nvidia reported quarterly earnings after the bell this afternoon, and despite a beat on the average estimate, it failed to meet the most lofty of expectations. Shares are down roughly 6% in post-market trading as a result. So for more, let's go now to Bloomberg Technology co-host Ed Ludlow in San Francisco. So Ed, obviously this is a behemoth. This is a stock that has the power to take the broader market with it. It didn't seem to do enough, but I guess enough is never really enough when you're talking a stock like this one.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, it's a beat against consensus estimates, but the very lofty estimates were very lofty indeed. And the story is still intact. There is no demand issue here. Basically, the cloud computing providers, the hyperscalers, we call them, that run data centers, continue to spend on Nvidia's product, high-performance GPUs and AI accelerators. They clarified some things on their next generation of that product, Blackwell, saying that there was indeed a design issue that they addressed, which will allow it to continue with a production ramp. And they gave us some kind of broad commentary that there will be sales of several $1 billion in their fiscal fourth quarter. But I think you're absolutely right. It's just never enough. And as you know, everyone, probably an exaggeration, many people around the world were watching this one.
Well, and we were watching, speaking of around the world, for anything we might hear when it comes to China, given the export controls the U.S. has put into place, the idea that that does, in fact, Nvidia's business. What color did we get around that, Ed?
Yeah, it's really interesting because it's as much about looking at what's not written down as what is. And there was not a single mention of China in the written materials. On the call, what Colette Kress, the CFO, said is that even though there will continue to be gains in the business for data centers in China sequentially, it's nowhere near the level it was when prior to U.S. trading restrictions, right, and export controls and technology controls. And the wording that they used is that that market will continue to be competitive. Though I would say at this point, the market's kind of priced that in and come to terms that China isn't really it for Nvidia right now.
And Ed, of course, you have a big interview coming up with the CEO of Nvidia in about an hour. What is your primary question for him? What does Jensen Huang most need to answer?
What's kind of beautiful about the Nvidia story is that whether you're an institutional retail investor or you're just interested in technology, people have very technical and granular questions for him. And I think the street wants that as well. Like, give us real specifics. For Balance of Power, they have a big business now selling to governments. It's a lot of what Jensen Huang's done this year, flying to nation states and doing deals. But just give us numbers. Like, how many dollars is that? They said low double-digit billions. I like specifics, and I think that's where we'll focus.
I like specifics, too. You and I have that in common, Ed. Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow, thank you so much, and good luck. Good luck later on. You can catch Ed in a special edition of Bloomberg Technology featuring that exclusive interview with NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang. That's coming up at 9:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Don't miss it. But of course, before we get there, we still have more Balance of Power coming up, and we'll shift our focus to geopolitics. Former U.S. Secretary of Defense William Cohen will be here as Israel launches an offensive in the West Bank. This is Bloomberg TV and radio.
Israel is not going to end this war, nor Hamas, until they are sure that they have achieved their goals or that they cannot achieve their goals. Israel is far closer than Hamas every time they rescue a hostage, every time they deter or contain threats from Hezbollah, from Lebanon, or from Iran, as they're doing now. Israel moves closer to this. At some point, Hamas will cave.
James Jeffrey, Wilson Center Chair of the Middle East Program and former U.S. Ambassador to Iraq and Turkey, speaking with me yesterday here on Balance of Power. As today, Israel launches a large-scale military operation in the West Bank. Joining us now for more on Bloomberg TV and radio is William Cohen. He is former U.S. Secretary of Defense and founder, chairman, and CEO of the Cohen Group. Mr. Secretary, welcome back to Bloomberg. It's great to have you. When we look at what Israel is doing in the West Bank, a large-scale military operation, part of a surge in activity we've seen in hostilities in that area since the war began after October 7th. What do you see is going on here? Is their activity in the West Bank a sign that they think their fighting in Gaza is closer to coming to an end?
I don't know if they can assume that. I would hope that the conflict in Gaza is coming to an end so there can be a ceasefire and an exchange of hostages as such, and then a plan for a state for the Palestinian people. But as far as the West Bank is concerned, I think the Israelis have adopted a policy of preemption. They are not going to wait to be attacked. As they were planning, they were seeing a plan evolve with Hezbollah in Lebanon, and they attacked. They're going to do the same thing in the West Bank, and so I don't think this came about overnight. I think this was long in the planning. I don't think the Biden administration or Biden-Harris administration had any foreknowledge of this, as negotiations are continuing to take place about Gaza in Egypt and elsewhere. But the Israelis have made it clear they're not going to wait. They're going to preempt whenever they can. My hope is they don't adopt the same plan of making a desert and calling it peace, to simply level all of the infrastructure in the West Bank and say, now we have peace. I don't think that will work. I think they'll be more specific than in their targeting, but not adopt a wholesale policy as they've done in Gaza.
Well, and as you allude to the ongoing ceasefire negotiations when it comes to Gaza, the U.S. keeps forecasting or telling us there's progress, and yet it does never seem to yield a deal in which all sides agree. So are you feeling confident that the ceasefire is ever going to happen, or should we be calling it a ceasefire? Is this more about humanitarian aid and the exchange of hostages now?
Well, I'm less confident than I was last week. The only optimism is they're still talking. As long as they're talking, there's still hope. But I think as we get closer and closer to a supposed agreement, either the Hamas or the Iranians through Hamas or Hezbollah or the Islamic Jihad or through the Houthis take some steps to break this up. It's very clear that Iran's goal is the destruction of the state of Israel. That's clear from the very beginning. And they want us, the United States, out of the Middle East so they can continue their revolution and establish an imperial regime throughout the region. So that's their goal. What we have to do is make sure we support the Israelis and defend them, help them defend themselves, and help them if they're attacked by other parties, including Iran, to defend them. So I think peace is not really in the offing if we look at it right now, but we have to hope that peace can be some measure of peace. I'm not sure there'll ever be peace in the Middle East, given history looking back to in 3,000 years. It's been going on forever. But we have to hope, given the stakes in the world, given the fact that nothing is local, what happens in the Middle East will affect all of us, all of our economies, all of our lives in one way or another. So we have to continue to strive for peace.
Well, sir, as you talk about history in the Middle East, what about history just going back 3 years? It has now been that long since the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, and Donald Trump and others have contended that that chaotic withdrawal is actually to blame for some of what we are seeing in the region now 3 years later. What do you think of that?
Well, there were some who were felt, and I shared that view, that we should not have had a complete pullout, that we needed to have a residual force, a international residual force with our allies to help maintain some level of deterrence in Afghanistan. That apparently was not the majority feeling in this country. That was not the feeling of Donald Trump, who actually wanted to pull out within 30 days notice. And President Biden said he stretched that out to 6 months, but the withdrawal was not a happy picture, to be sure, and there were lives lost that didn't need to be lost, in my opinion and that of others. But the fact is, it's like anything else. If you create a vacuum, the terrorists will come back. And that is the fear that we have, that there'll be a training ground once again for other groups to train in Afghanistan to launch attacks against us and our allies in the region and through other parts of the world. That's the world in which we live. We have to be constantly vigilant. We have to constantly have a counter-terrorist, counterinsurgency strategy, and be on guard at all times, because the world is a very turbulent and dangerous place.
Well, and of course, we're seeing turbulence in other areas of the world as well, Mr. Secretary, including the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. But Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said this week that he would like to have a discussion with President Biden at the UN General Assembly next month about bringing an end to this war, discussing a plan to force Russia to halt its invasion of Ukraine. He said that this would comprise a powerful package to use diplomacy, economic steps, and consider Ukraine's place in the global security architecture. What do you expect that plan could actually look like?
Well, there were many proposals at the very beginning when Putin invaded Ukraine. There were proposals that what a settlement might look like. The fact is that President Zelensky has said, I'm not giving up 1 inch of Ukrainian territory to the Russians, who have violated the international rules of law, the rules we've had in place since the end of World War II, and I want all my territory back. Many people felt that was unrealistic, but on the other hand, the Ukrainians were willing to fight and die for it. At this particular point, I don't think that the Ukrainians can hope to win through negotiation what they can't win on the battlefield. They're going to have to inflict much more damage against the Russians before Putin will be willing to say, let's make a deal. So I think in the time between now and the UN General Assembly, between now and the time that winter sets on, I think with the help of the United States and the European allies giving Ukrainians much more firepower, that may give them an opportunity to reach some sort of an accord with the Russians. But I think Putin's going to have to suffer much more before he agrees to any kind of a compromise.
Well, and do you think Putin will ever get to that point so long as China is still in his corner? I ask you this, sir, knowing U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan is in China as we speak, meeting with senior officials. What role does China play in this, and frankly, the Middle East as well, all of the conflicts globally we're talking about?
Well, as far as the Russians are concerned, they're waiting and hoping that former President Trump will be elected. He has told Putin, take whatever you want of Ukraine, do whatever hell you want throughout the NATO countries. And so the Russians are looking for a Trump victory to give them the victory they want in taking all of Ukraine. With respect to China, China is supporting Russia, and they're supporting them covertly, if not overtly, and providing them with some munitions, also coming from North Korea. But the Chinese are more focused up at this particular point on what's going on with respect to Taiwan. From the Chinese perspective, if President Trump were elected and if he were to sell out the Ukrainians, they would look at that and say, well, wait a minute. If the U.S. is not willing to help Ukraine, which is fighting for its freedom, why would they want to come all the way over to China off the coast of Taiwan and fight to defend the Taiwanese? They would look upon that as an incentive to take either military action or certainly action which could isolate the Taiwanese and could count on the United States not to come to the Taiwanese aid. So there's a lot involved geopolitically in terms of who gets elected, how they're calculating that. But we also have to send a strong signal to the Chinese. Don't take action. You need not take action. We're not supporting independence of Taiwan. You need not be that aggressive against Taiwan, and you surely shouldn't be that aggressive against the Philippines, because we have a military treaty, a mutual treaty with the Philippines, to a defense treaty, not only with the Philippines, but also with Japan in that greater region. We have a lot at stake. I think the Chinese would make a big mistake if they were to use force, and I don't think they're planning on that at this point.
All right, sir, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for your time this evening. That's William Cohen, former U.S. Secretary of Defense and founder, chairman, and CEO of the Cohen Group. Now, coming up, highlights from my conversation with the co-chair of the RNC, Lara Trump. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kaylee Lines. Lara Trump, co-chair of the Republican National Committee and Donald Trump's daughter-in-law, says Republicans don't need to close the fundraising gap that has emerged with Kamala Harris in order to win in November. She spoke with me earlier today here on Bloomberg.
You look back at the 2016 race between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, and she far outraised us. And we know the outcome of that election. Now, of course, money is important. It affords us the ability to buy TV ads, to do digital advertising, to have a great ground game. And we're really proud of the number that we've raised so far. I think our most proud number may be our small dollar digital online fundraising. We are approaching our 50th day of over $1 million raised in small dollar donations. These are donations under like $40 on average. And I think what that says is that you have have the support of the American people behind Donald Trump right now. So we always aim to raise more money. We always try to encourage people to donate. And even in this bad economy that really is hurting so many people, we are still seeing very big fundraising numbers for Donald Trump.
Well, as you talk about the small dollar donors specifically, is that where you think more of the money you can raise will come from the grassroots, or are there other big ticket donors that you think you can pull in who may not have yet contributed to the campaign?
Well, we do have our eye on some donors who we're bringing back into the fold, or maybe some new donors. I won't give any names today, but some new donors as well. Look, you've seen Donald Trump really resonate with Silicon Valley over the past 6 months or so, and I think he's really shaken a lot of people awake, and a lot of people are now realizing how much better off their life, their businesses, and the trajectory of this country were when he was in office. And so you're seeing a lot of new donors and first-time donors as well come in a very big way. I do a lot of fundraising calls. I go to a lot of fundraising events. And oftentimes there are people coming up to me saying, I have never been to any political fundraiser in my life. I'm here maxing out to the RNC and the Trump campaign because they want Donald Trump back in office.
Well, ma'am, of course, it's one thing to raise money. It's another to consider how to spend it and what the strategy should be and how it should change now that it's Kamala Harris at the top of the Democratic ticket instead of Joe Biden. Polling is consistently showing us that it does seem the map may be wider for her than it was for Biden in terms of states she could win. She, of course, is spending time in Georgia today. There's indications she's polling better in North Carolina. Do you have to rethink your allocation to some of those states, like in the Sun Belt, now that it is the Harris campaign, not the Biden one?
Yeah, well, listen, of course, you have a different candidate. You do have to change your tactic to an extent. And we certainly are doing certain things in very specific states. And we're looking at all the same polling as well. And we're making sure that where we need to kind of firm things up, we're going to allocate a little bit more money there. We're going to put more boots on the ground in those areas.
If I could just get some more detail from you, Lara, you were talking about identifying potentially areas in which you will now need to shift strategy and invest more resources. Could you illustrate for us where some of those areas are? Is it North Carolina? Is it Georgia? Where exactly are you now targeting to a greater degree?
Yeah, well, listen, North Carolina is definitely a state where we've seen some movement. It looked very positive for Donald Trump in whenever he was going against Joe Biden. It still shows Donald Trump up on Kamala Harris, but we want to make sure that we increase that lead. So we certainly are prepared to put more money into that state. It is my home state, and it's one that I, of course, want to win. And I think Pennsylvania is a must-win state. I think that, you know, every election cycle we have seen consistently how important that state has become. I think the margins have tightened quite a bit there. You're going to see Donald Trump in Wisconsin coming up today. And so, you know, we're making sure that everywhere that we felt very good prior to Kamala Harris being the nominee for the Democrats, we want to feel just as good on the other side of things. So we're prepared to invest wherever we need.
That was Lara Trump, co-chair of the RNC and Donald Trump's daughter-in-law, speaking with me earlier today here on Bloomberg. And coming up, we'll get some reaction from our political panel as J.D. Vance talks the economy and Kamala Harris hits the road in Georgia with Tim Walz. We'll have more next on Bloomberg TV and radio.
One of the reasons why this community has been left behind by our leaders is we decided we were going to let companies make things using Chinese slave labor. And I happen to think we shouldn't expect Americans to compete with a bunch of Chinese slave laborers. We ought to expect American companies to hire American and build in the United States of America. And if you do more of that, you're going to bring more jobs to Erie, Pennsylvania. You're going to build the economic foundation of this place.
Republican vice presidential nominee J.D. Vance taking aim at China earlier today in Erie, Pennsylvania, as he campaigns in that key swing state, while Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are in another, kicking off a bus tour today through Georgia. For our TV viewers, you're looking at Harris and Walz in Hinsville, Georgia, moments ago. And now for more on the campaign trail, our political panel joins me. Brittany Martinez, Republican strategist and Espina & Company founder and CEO, and Jim Kessler, co-founder and executive vice president of policy at Third Way. So, Jim, I want to come to you first because they're not just going to Georgia. They're going to rural Georgia specifically, trying to target areas of the state where they might not necessarily be able to win, but they could potentially improve the margins. How do you consider the way in which they're deciding to spend time and resources down there?
Right. Well, I think that's smart. If you look at how Harris is doing compared to Biden, okay, and pre-debate, she's doing better among voters of color, among women, among young people. She's doing worse than Biden among white men over the age of 60 and certainly in rural areas. Tim Walz is a good choice in rural areas. If you can steal a couple of votes there, if you can keep those margins down instead of 83-17, maybe 78-22, you can more easily win Georgia, North Carolina, some other places.
Well, the Sun Belt states that weren't necessarily as much in play for Joe Biden as they now seem to be for Kamala Harris. This is something I spoke about earlier with Lara Trump. We just heard a bit of that, Brittany, this notion that they might have to deploy, being the RNC, the Trump campaign, resources in areas that they thought were safe. How are they going to go about doing this?
I mean, I'd love to know what their plan is, because what resources? I think we were talking the other day, if you recall, it was a few months ago at this point, but when Lara Trump became the co-chair, she said every single penny is going to be used for Donald Trump. And I believe that some of the, and I used to work at the RNC, and if I recall correctly, I think that they kind of shut down some of those local offices. So they're probably regretting it at this point. But yes, they're going to have to spend a lot of money in some of these swing states for sure.
Yeah, and of course they have raised hundreds of billions of dollars. It just is not to the same degree that Kamala Harris has been able to raise in her still very early candidacy. The Republican ticket, Brittany, spending time, as we saw, in Pennsylvania, then Wisconsin later today. They've been in Michigan this week, Trump and Vance. Are they smart to be centering their time on the blue wall while Harris is down in Georgia?
I mean, I think that it is a smart strategy. This is going to be a really tight race anyway, and might as well try to hit some of those pockets. I think it's going to be important. Obviously, the Harris-Walz campaign, they're going to be back on the road, too, with their bus tour. But, yeah, I think that I saw an article today about, like, gun owners and, folks who hunt and those sorts of things. And I think that there's probably a lot of different demographics that they're aiming to get during this little tour that they're doing.
Tim Walz, of course, a gun owner and hunter himself. He's made that well known. It's not just a bus tour of Georgia that's happening. They're also going to sit down for an interview in Georgia, Jim. The two of them together on CNN tomorrow night. This is something we've all been waiting for.
Oh, yeah.
4 weeks. How high are the stakes specifically for Harris?
Right. So the last 5 weeks, Harris has gained and gained and gained without doing one of these sit-down interviews with the media. And it reminds me of this. Woody Hayes, a legendary Ohio State football coach, talked about the forward pass. 3 things can happen, and 2 of them are bad. So the goal for these live interviews is like that nothing bad happens, because really this is an elite discussion. Is she going to sit down with the media? She's been gaining and gaining and gaining. She doesn't want to do anything that's going to halt that momentum. That's the importance here.
Well, and how do you consider the timing of this interview and then 10 days or so later, the debate happening with Donald Trump? Is that a ideal situation? Because if she does take missteps in the interview tomorrow, she can correct them at the debate? Or does it actually give Trump more ammunition when he's sharing a stage with her?
Look, I think when we ended the convention, okay, that was the end of Act 1 of the Harris-Walz campaign. And it was a great act. People were riveted. They were in their seats. They raised a lot of money. Act 2 is we're mixing it up. We're mixing it up with the press. We're mixing it up with the other candidate. And look, it's never going to be sort of a straight shot going up. There's going to be ups and there's going to be downs. I don't expect her to do anything like really damaging in a live interview tomorrow. But the debate is really high stakes. I think it's a real opportunity for her. I think she'll do well in this kind of debate. I would worry a little bit more about Donald Trump. He didn't do well in the Biden debate. The problem was Biden was atrocious, so people didn't notice.
Well, and of course, Donald Trump has now firmly said, yes, I will be there on ABC on September 10th. He says it'll be the same rules as that CNN debate. Brittany, the Harris campaign indicating not so fast. Does it matter whether the mics stay on the whole time?
I mean, I think it would be fun for the mics to stay on, but whether they're on or off, I think that we'll all sort of see Trump's reaction anyway, and he's not the best at the poker face, I'd say, and so maybe you won't be able to hear him. You'll be able to see exactly what he's thinking, and so we'll see.
Well, that's fair enough. Of course, we'll all be staying tuned for that. Just quickly, I asked Lara Trump about this, but Jim, she said that Donald Trump is good at branding people. He did it with Hillary Clinton. He did it with his opponents in this Republican primary. Do you think he's figured out a way yet to brand Kamala Harris?
No. And he's done a good job of branding generally within his own party. Look, Hillary Clinton probably would have won in 2016 if there wasn't the Anthony Weiner emails at the very end. So, he's not, There's kryptonite out there.
All right, Jim Kessler and Brittany Martinez, our political panel this evening. Thank you both so much for joining me, and thank all of you for joining us here on Balance of Power. We'll see you back tomorrow on Bloomberg TV and radio.